The sun, a molten coin on the horizon, bled streaks of crimson and gold across the vast Wyoming sky. Dust devils danced lazily across the parched earth, the only movement in a landscape that felt as ancient and untamed as time itself. In the distance, the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains stood as silent sentinels, their snow-capped crowns mocking the heat that shimmered off the plains. Elias Thorne, his face a roadmap of sun-weathered lines and etched worry, squinted against the glare. His worn Stetson, a faithful companion through countless seasons, did little to shield him from the relentless sun. He sat astride his bay mare, restless, his gaze fixed on the thin plume of smoke rising from the distant Crow encampment. It was a sight that usually brought a measure of peace, a sign that his neighbors, though different, were still there, a constant presence in the ever-shifting west. But today, that smoke felt like a harbinger, a dark omen whispering of uncertainty. His ranch, a modest spread carved out of the unforgiving land, lay nestled in a valley that in better times had been a haven. Now it felt like a fragile outpost, vulnerable to the whims of nature and the encroaching shadows of doubt. The recent drought had been brutal, cracking the earth and withering the meager grass that sustained his small herd. His supplies were dwindling, and the gnawing fear of a harsh winter pressed down on him like a physical weight. His wife, Sarah, a woman whose strength was as quiet and unwavering as a mountain stream, had been his rock. But Sarah was gone, taken by a fever that swept through the territory like wildfire, leaving Elias adrift in a sea of grief and responsibility. And then there was young Thomas, his son, a boy of 10, with Sarah's bright eyes and Elias's determined chin, but too young, Elias feared, to truly understand the harsh realities they faced. Thomas, oblivious to the heavy thoughts clouding his father's mind, was chasing a tumbleweed with a stick, his laughter a thin, reedy sound against the immensity of the plains. Elias watched him, a pang of fierce protectiveness tightening his chest. The boy was all he had left, all he had to fight for. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and the faint metallic tang of distant dust. He walked towards the boy, his shadow stretching long before him. "Thomas," he called, his voice rough but gentle. "It's time to head back. The sun will be down soon." Thomas, his face flushed with exertion and excitement, trotted back, the stick clutched triumphantly in his hand. "Look, Papa, I almost caught it." Elias managed a smile, ruffling the boy's sandy hair. "You're a fast one, son. Almost as fast as your mother." The mention of Sarah brought a familiar ache to his throat. He quickly suppressed it. He couldn't afford to break down. Not now, not with Thomas watching. As they walked back towards the small, sturdy cabin that had once echoed with Sarah's laughter, Elias's gaze drifted back to the distant Crow camp. He knew Chief Black Bear, a man of few words but immense wisdom, and his people. He'd traded with them for years, a wary but respectful coexistence forged in the shared struggle against the harshness of the land. They were skilled hunters, their knowledge of the territory unparalleled. They understood the rhythm of the seasons, the language of the animals, the secrets of survival in this unforgiving wilderness. Yet, a flicker of unease persisted. The white settlers were expanding, their settlements pushing further west, their demands on the land growing with each passing year. Tensions had been simmering, fueled by misunderstandings, greed, and a deep-seated fear of the unknown. Elias, caught between two worlds, often felt the pull of both and the firm footing of neither. He sighed, the sound lost in the immensity of the prairie. He had to find a way to secure his ranch, to ensure Thomas's future. But how? The land offered little, and the winter promised to be unforgiving. He glanced at the Crow smoke again, a silent question hanging in the vast, indifferent sky. Could he rely on them, his neighbors, his fellow inhabitants of this wild land, when the true tests of survival began? The whisper of the wind seemed to carry no answers, only the echoing shadow of doubt. The cabin, though small, was a testament to Sarah's quiet industry. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, their scent a faint, comforting aroma. A patchwork quilt, meticulously crafted by her own hands, covered the rough-hewn table. Elias moved through the familiar space, the silence amplifying the absence of his wife. Every object, every shadow, seemed to hold an echo of her laughter, a ghost of her presence that both soothed and tormented him. He prepared a simple supper of beans and jerky, the familiar ritual a small anchor in the turbulent sea of his grief. Thomas sat at the table, his small hands struggling to hold his fork, his gaze fixed on his father. The boy, too, felt the weight of the silence, the missing piece in their small world. "Papa," Thomas began, his voice barely a whisper, "when will Mama come back?" Elias's heart twisted. He knelt beside the boy, his rough hand gently cupping Thomas's cheek. She's in a better place now, son. We have to be strong, like she would have wanted us to be." He struggled to find words that would convey comfort without shattering the fragile innocence of his son's understanding. It was a delicate dance, navigating the treacherous terrain of childhood grief. Thomas looked down at his plate, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. Elias pulled him into a tight embrace, holding him close, feeling the smallness of his son, the immense burden of protecting him. "We'll be all right, Thomas," he murmured, the words a prayer more than a promise. "We have each other." Later, as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in hues of purple and fiery orange, Elias sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle. The familiar weight of the weapon was a comfort, a tangible symbol of his ability to protect. But even as he meticulously oiled the metal, his mind wrestled with the limitations of such protection. A rifle could ward off a lone wolf or a desperate outlaw, but it offered little defense against a failing harvest, a harsh winter, or the insidious creep of despair. He thought of the Crow encampment again. Their way of life was intricately tied to the land, their survival dependent on their understanding of its cycles and its dangers. They knew which plants were edible, how to track game through the roughest terrain, how to read the subtle signs of approaching storms. Elias, a rancher by trade, felt his own knowledge of the wild was superficial in comparison. He remembered a time, years ago, when a particularly brutal blizzard had trapped him and Sarah in their cabin for days. Their meager supplies had run dangerously low. It was a hunting party from the Crow tribe, led by Black Bear himself, who had found them, sharing their kill and ensuring they survived until the snows abated. It was an act of unexpected kindness, a bridge built across the chasm of cultural differences. "We are all children of this land," Black Bear had said then, his voice deep and resonant, his eyes holding a wisdom that transcended words. "When the land suffers, we all suffer. We help each other." Those words echoed in Elias's mind now, a flicker of hope in the encroaching darkness, but the memory was tinged with the reality of the present. The settlers' encroachment, the growing unease, the whispers of land disputes, these were new complexities, new tensions that strained the bonds of that old trust. Could that old kindness still hold true in this new, more troubled West? Thomas emerged from the cabin, a worn wooden toy horse in his hand. He sat beside Elias, his small legs dangling over the porch railing, watching the stars begin to prick the velvet sky. "Papa," he asked, his voice soft, "are there wolves out there tonight?" Elias instinctively reached for his rifle, his eyes scanning the darkened prairie. The sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, seemed amplified in the silence. "There might be, son, but we're safe here." He put an arm around Thomas, drawing him close. The boy's small frame trembled slightly, and Elias knew he was trying to be brave, just as his father was trying to be. He looked out at the vast, star-dusted expanse, a profound sense of isolation settling over him. He was a man caught between the past and an uncertain future, a widower trying to shield his son from the harsh realities of a world that seemed determined to test them at every turn. The fading echoes of Sarah's laughter were a bittersweet reminder of what he had lost, and the gnawing fear for Thomas's future was a constant, heavy weight. He needed more than just his rifle. He needed a strength that came from more than just himself. He needed to believe in the possibility of that old kindness, that ancient bond with the land and its people. The following morning dawned with an oppressive stillness. The air, usually alive with the calls of birds and the rustling of wind through the sparse grasses, felt heavy and expectant. Elias, after a restless night, emerged from the cabin to find Thomas still asleep, his small face peaceful in slumber. He wouldn't wake the boy just yet. There were matters to attend to, decisions to be made, and a gnawing sense of unease that clung to him like the morning dew. He saddled his mare, his movements economical and practiced. His first stop, as always, was the small corral where his handful of cattle huddled, their ribs showing a little too starkly. The drought had hit them hard, and he feared he wouldn't have enough feed to see them through the winter. He needed to sell some, but the prices offered by the traders in the nearest town were insultingly low. As he checked the fence line, a glint of metal caught his eye. Half hidden in the dry grass, a discarded tin can. Nothing unusual, perhaps, but the way it lay, almost deliberately placed, sent a shiver down his spine. He kicked at the grass, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. He found another, then another. Small, seemingly insignificant objects, but their presence felt like a violation. He moved further along the fence, his senses on high alert. The silence of the morning was no longer peaceful, it was predatory. He heard it then, a faint rustling in the dry scrub, too deliberate to be the wind. He froze, his hand instinctively going to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. From the tall grass, a figure emerged. Not one of his hands, he had none, but a man he'd seen before, a drifter named Silas, who sometimes did odd jobs in town for a pittance. Silas was lean and wiry, with shifty eyes that darted nervously. He wore patched overalls and a grimy cap pulled low over his brow. "Mornin', Thorne," Silas said, his voice raspy, a forced casualness in his tone. He held a small, crudely fashioned snare in his hand. "Just looking for rabbits." Elias's gaze was steady, unblinking. He knew Silas wasn't hunting rabbits. "This is my land, Silas, and you know the rules about hunting on private property." Silas shifted his weight, his gaze flicking towards the distant crow camp. "Ain't seen no rabbits. Just passing through." He made a move to leave, but Elias blocked his path. "What were you doing near my fence line?" Elias's voice was quiet, but it carried an edge of steel. Silas's eyes narrowed. "Nothing. Just walking." He spat on the ground. "Heard you was in a bad way. Crops dried up, wife gone. Tough times." A cold dread settled in Elias's stomach. This wasn't just a random drifter. Silas was probing, looking for weakness. "My business is my own," Elias said, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. Silas gave a short, humorless laugh. "Sure, Thorne, sure. Just trying to be neighborly. Some folks ain't so neighborly, though. Some folks might see a man alone, unprotected." He let the words hang in the air, a veiled threat. "Especially when that man's got something worth taking." He glanced pointedly towards the small herd of cattle. Elias felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice even. "You best be moving on, Silas, and don't let me catch you on my land again." Silas met his gaze for a moment, a flicker of something, malice, desperation, greed in his eyes. Then, with a shrug, he turned and disappeared back into the scrub. Elias watched him go, his jaw tight. The encounter had confirmed his deepest fears. He wasn't just battling the elements. He was facing human predators, individuals who preyed on misfortune. Silas represented the darker side of the West, the opportunistic souls who saw vulnerability as an invitation to exploit. He knew he couldn't afford to be careless. He had to protect Thomas, his ranch, and what little they had left. The thought of Silas spreading rumors, of other desperate men being drawn to his weakened state, was a chilling prospect. He looked towards the Crow encampment, a distant, silent presence on the horizon. He had always tried to maintain a respectful distance, a cautious neutrality. But now, with the serpent in the grass revealing itself, Elias began to understand that perhaps, in this vast and often unforgiving land, true safety lay not in isolation, but in the strength of unexpected alliances. The question was, would those alliances still be there when he truly needed them? The encounter with Silas had left Elias with a gnawing disquiet. He spent the rest of the day reinforcing the flimsy fences around his small herd, his movements fueled by a new urgency. Every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every gust of wind carried a hint of menace. He found himself constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his rifle. That evening, as he watched Thomas meticulously arrange smooth stones on the porch steps, Elias made a decision. He needed to speak with Black Bear. The memory of the blizzard, of the crow's timely assistance, weighed heavily on his mind. He needed to gauge the mood of the tribe, to understand if the old bonds of neighborliness could withstand the pressures of the changing times. The next morning, before the sun had fully climbed its arc, Elias set out. He rode his mare, the familiar trail leading him towards the Crow encampment, a cluster of sturdy teepees nestled in a sheltered valley a day's ride away. The journey itself was a stark reminder of the land's immensity and his own smallness within it. He passed through vast stretches of scrubland, crossed dry creek beds, and skirted around rocky outcrops, the silence broken only by the rhythmic beat of his horse's hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. As he approached the encampment, he saw figures moving about, their movements purposeful and unhurried. Children played, their laughter carrying on the breeze, a stark contrast to the silence that had settled over his own home. Women tended to their tasks, their colorful clothing a vibrant splash against the muted tones of the landscape. He dismounted at the edge of the camp, his rifle slung across his back, his hands visible. He stood for a moment, a solitary figure, waiting to be acknowledged. Soon, a young Crow warrior, his face impassive, approached him. "You are Elias Thorn," the warrior stated, his voice neutral. "I am," Elias replied, his own voice steady. "I have come to speak with Black Bear." The warrior nodded and gestured for Elias to follow him. He led Elias through the camp, past curious glances from the villagers, towards a larger, more ornately decorated tepee. As they approached, the flap was lifted by an elder, his face a tapestry of wrinkles, his eyes holding the calm depth of a deep well. This was Black Bear. Black Bear regarded Elias with a quiet intensity. He did not offer a handshake, but nodded his head in greeting. "Your journey was long, Elias Thorn. What brings you to our camp?" Elias spoke plainly, his words carefully chosen. He explained the drought, the dwindling supplies, his concern for Thomas. He spoke of Silas, of the veiled threats and the opportunistic nature he had encountered. He did not ask for help directly, but laid bare his situation, seeking counsel. "The land is harsh this year, Elias Thorn," Black Bear said, his voice a low rumble. "The buffalo are scarce and the streams run low. We too feel the pinch of hunger." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "Silas. He is a man who listens to the whispers of greed. Such men are like dry brush. They catch fire easily." Elias waited, his heart pounding softly. He knew Black Bear understood the implications of Silas's presence. Black Bear continued, "The settlers push further. They see our land, our ways, and they fear what they do not understand. Fear makes men foolish. It makes them cruel." He looked directly at Elias. "You have always treated us with respect, Elias Thorn. You have shown a good heart. That is remembered." He gestured for Elias to enter his tepee. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. A small fire crackled in the center, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Black Bear sat on a worn blanket, Elias taking a seat opposite him. "You speak of protection," Black Bear said, his eyes fixed on the flames. "A rifle can stop a single threat, but the threats to a man and his son are many. The land itself can be a threat. Hunger can be a threat. Loneliness can be a threat." Elias listened intently, absorbing every word. He knew Black Bear was not just speaking of physical dangers. "There are times," Black Bear continued, "when a man must stand alone. But there are also times when a man must know who his true neighbors are. The wolves that hunt in the night are one kind of danger. The men who see only what they can take are another. Both must be watched." Black Bear reached for a small, intricately carved wooden bird. "This little bird," he said, holding it out to Elias. "It flies where the wind takes it. It finds its own way. But it also knows where to find water, where to find seeds. It relies on its knowledge of the land." He placed the bird in Elias's hand. "You have knowledge of your ranch. We have knowledge of this territory. Together, our knowledge is greater." Elias closed his hand around the smooth wood. It was not a promise of direct aid, but something more profound, an acknowledgement of shared vulnerability and a subtle reaffirmation of an existing, albeit strained, connection. Black Bear's counsel was a reminder that survival in the West often depended on more than just strength of arms. It depended on understanding, on relationships, and on the willingness to bridge divides when the wolves, both four-legged and two-legged, came calling. Elias rode back to his ranch with the carved bird clutched in his hand, Black Bear's words a quiet echo in his mind. The counsel had been cryptic, yet undeniably reassuring. It wasn't a blank check for assistance, but a reaffirmation of a connection, a subtle acknowledgement that their fates, in some measure, were intertwined. The land, Black Bear had implied, demanded a shared understanding, a collective vigilance. As he neared his home, the landscape seemed to shift. The oppressive stillness of the previous day had given way to a restless wind that whipped dust into the air, obscuring the distant horizon. It was a wind that carried more than just grit. It seemed to carry whispers, fragments of unease that Elias couldn't quite grasp. He saw Thomas sitting on the porch, his small shoulders slumped, a look of dejection on his face. As Elias dismounted, Thomas ran to him, his eyes wide. "Papa, something happened!" Thomas's voice was a mixture of fear and excitement. "What is it, son?" Elias asked, his hand automatically reaching for his Colt. The cows," Thomas stammered, pointing towards the corral. "One of them is gone." Elias's heart leaped into his throat. He hurried to the corral, his eyes scanning the fence line. Thomas was right. A section of the fence near the back was torn open, the wooden posts splintered, and a single cow, one of his best milkers, was missing. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at him. This was no accident. This was the work of Silas, or someone like him, exploiting the weakness he had noticed. The whispers on the wind suddenly felt more sinister, the shadows in the dust more menacing. "Did you see who did it, Thomas?" Elias asked, his voice tight. Thomas shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "No, Papa. I was playing out back. I heard a noise, like wood breaking, but I thought it was just the wind. When I came to look, the fence was broken and Daisy was gone." Daisy, the cow's name, a simple affection, now represented a significant loss. Elias surveyed the torn fence, the churned earth. Whoever had done this was strong, and they had been swift and stealthy. They had taken advantage of his brief absence, of his perceived vulnerability. He looked out at the vast, unforgiving landscape. The wind, now howling, whipping Thomas's hair around his face. He felt a surge of anger, but it was tempered by a grim understanding. This was the reality of the West. Every gain was hard-won, and every loss could be devastating. "We need to track her," Elias said, his voice firm, masking the fear that gnawed at him. "Get me my tracking gear, Thomas, and your canteen." Thomas, despite his fear, nodded, his young face set with determination. He disappeared into the cabin, emerging moments later with a worn leather pouch containing Elias's tracking tools. Elias knelt, examining the ground near the broken fence. He found tracks, heavy boot prints, distinct from his own, leading away from the corral, towards the north, towards the territory that bordered the Crow lands. But these tracks were not alone. Interspersed with them, almost erased by the wind, and the larger prints were smaller, more delicate tracks, the tracks of a wolf. He frowned. It was unusual for wolves to be so bold, so close to the ranch, especially in broad daylight. Had Silas, or whoever he was working with, used the wolves as a distraction, or perhaps even as a means to drive the cow away? The thought was disturbing. The natural world and human greed seemed to be converging in a terrifying way. "It looks like wolves were here too, Papa," Thomas said, pointing to the faint prints. Elias nodded grimly. "It does, son. It does." He knew he couldn't let this deter him. He had to recover Daisy. It wasn't just about the milk. It was about the principle, about not letting these predators dictate terms. He mounted his mare, Thomas scrambling up behind him, his small arms wrapped tightly around his father's waist. "Hold on tight, son," Elias murmured. "We're going after her." As they rode out, the wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of dust and the faint, unsettling musk of wild animals. The shadows in the dust seemed to stretch and writhe, no longer just an illusion of the fading light, but a tangible representation of the dangers that lurked just beyond the edge of his small, isolated world. The whispers on the wind were no longer just whispers. They were warnings, and Elias Thorne knew he had to heed them, not just for himself, but for the boy clinging to his back, for the future he desperately hoped to secure. The trail was faint, a mere suggestion in the parched earth, but Elias's practiced eye could follow it. The boot prints of the thief were clear enough, but the accompanying wolf tracks were more ephemeral, often lost in the shifting dust and wind-blown debris. Elias rode with a grim determination, Thomas perched behind him, his small face set with a worried resolve. "Are you sure it was Silas, Papa?" Thomas asked, his voice a small tremor against the immensity of the prairie. "He don't know for sure, son," Elias admitted, his gaze fixed on the ground. "But he was here, snooping around, and he was talking about people taking advantage." He pointed to a distinct scuff mark. "See how these prints are deeper here? Whoever it was, they were moving fast, maybe hurrying the cow along." The trail led them north, away from the familiar pastures and towards the rugged, less-traveled territory that bordered the lands of the Crow. The landscape grew more desolate, the sparse vegetation giving way to windswept mesas and jagged rock formations. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the air grew hotter, drier. Elias paused, dismounting to examine the tracks more closely. The wolf tracks were more prominent here, weaving in and out of the human footprints, a silent, unsettling escort. He wondered if the wolves had been drawn by the scent of the cow, or if they had been deliberately herded, perhaps by Silas, to drive her away from the ranch and towards a more secluded spot. The latter thought sent a chill down his spine. It spoke of a calculated cruelty, a willingness to exploit the wildness of nature for nefarious purposes. "Wolves are dangerous, Papa," Thomas whispered, his eyes wide as he looked at the faint prints. "And they are, son," Elias said, his hand resting reassuringly on his son's shoulder. "But they're just animals trying to survive, same as us. It's the man behind them, if there is one, that we need to worry about." He remounted, and they continued their pursuit. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the land. The wind picked up, swirling dust around them, making the tracking even more difficult. Elias knew they couldn't afford to lose the trail. Daisy was a valuable asset, and more importantly, her loss represented a clear message of vulnerability. Suddenly, Elias reined in his horse. Ahead, nestled in a small, rocky ravine, he saw it. A lone heifer, Daisy, standing uncertainly, her head lowered. But she wasn't alone. Emerging from the shadows of the ravine were two figures. Elias recognized one of them instantly, Silas, his grimy cap pulled low, his shifty eyes darting nervously. The other man was larger, with a rough, unkempt beard and a surly expression. Elias had seen him around town, a known troublemaker named Jed. "Looks like your rabbits were a bit bigger than you thought, Silas," Jed grunted, kicking at Daisy's flank. The heifer flinched, but didn't move. "Just get her ready," Silas hissed, his eyes scanning the surrounding hills, a clear sign of his unease. "We don't want Thorn coming back for her." Elias's blood boiled. He saw the desperation in their eyes, the greed that drove them. He also saw the danger they represented, not just to him, but to Thomas. He had to act, but he also had to be careful. He was outnumbered, and Jed looked like a man who wouldn't shy away from a fight. He nudged his mare forward, emerging from behind a cluster of rocks. "Hold it right there!" he called out, his voice resonating with authority, though his heart pounded in his chest. Silas and Jed spun around, startled. Silas's face contorted with surprise and anger. Jed's hand went to the pistol at his hip. "Well, looky here," Jed sneered, his eyes narrowing. "It's Thorn. Come for your cow, have you?" "That cow belongs on my ranch," Elias stated, his gaze unwavering. "And you two have no right to her." Silas stepped forward, his bravado returning. "Finders keepers, Thorn, and we found her wandering." "She didn't wander," Elias countered, his voice steady. "You broke my fence. You stole her." He subtly shifted his position, ensuring Thomas was shielded behind him. "Now you can either let her go and ride out, or you can face the consequences." Jed laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Consequences? What consequences, Thorn? You alone against two of us?" He drew his pistol. "I reckon we can handle you." Elias felt a cold dread wash over him. He had underestimated them. He had walked into a trap. The wind howled around them, a mournful soundtrack to the escalating confrontation. The wolf tracks, Elias realized with a sickening lurch, had been more than just a coincidence. They had been a sign, a harbinger of the very danger he now faced. The standoff in the ravine was tense, the air crackling with unspoken threats. Jed's pistol was leveled at Elias, his finger tightening on the trigger. Silas, emboldened by the presence of Jed and the apparent disadvantage Elias was in, stood a step behind, a smirk playing on his lips. Daisy, sensing the danger, shifted nervously, her large eyes wide with fear. "Just hand over the cow, Thorn, and maybe we won't have to get unpleasant," Jed growled, his gaze hard and unforgiving. Elias gripped his rifle, his knuckles white. He knew he couldn't outdraw Jed, not with Thomas directly behind him. A stray shot could be disastrous. He scanned the ravine, his mind racing for an escape. But Jed and Silas had positioned themselves strategically, blocking the only clear path back. Suddenly a low growl, deep and guttural, echoed from the rocky slopes above them. It was a sound that sent a shiver down Silas's spine and made Jed's eyes widen slightly. Elias knew that sound. It was the sound of a wolf. But this growl was different. It wasn't the lone cry of a scavenger. It was a chorus. From the shadows of the rocks, from the crevices and overhangs, more wolves began to emerge. Not one or two, but a pack. They moved with a silent predatory grace, their eyes glinting in the fading light, their forms sleek and powerful against the rugged terrain. They didn't attack, not yet. They simply watched, their presence a palpable force, a silent, ancient power asserting itself. Silas and Jed froze, their bravado evaporating like mist in the morning sun. They had clearly underestimated the wildness of this territory and the territorial nature of its inhabitants. Elias, though wary, felt a strange sense of relief. The wolves, in their own wild way, were intervening. "What in blazes?" Jed muttered, his pistol wavering. Silas, his face pale, stammered, They're just wolves, Jed. They won't do nothing." But his voice lacked conviction. He, more than Jed, seemed to understand the unspoken language of these animals, the sheer force of their collective presence. One of the larger wolves, a grey-coated male with intelligent eyes, took a step forward, letting out a low, menacing snarl. It was a clear warning. The ravine, it seemed, was not theirs to claim. Jed, clearly unnerved, began to back away slowly, pulling Silas with him. "All right, Thorn," he grunted, his voice tight. "You can have your damn cow. This ain't worth it." Silas didn't argue. He cast a fearful, resentful glance at Elias and then at the watchful wolves. The dream of an easy score had turned into a nightmare. "This ain't over, Thorn," Silas spat, his voice strained. "You can't hide behind no damn wolves forever." They scrambled back up the ravine, their retreat clumsy and hurried, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Elias watched them go, his rifle still trained on them until they were out of sight. He then turned his attention to the wolves. They remained for a few more moments, their watchful eyes fixed on Elias and Daisy before melting back into the shadows as silently as they had appeared. Elias let out a long, shaky breath. He looked at Daisy, who, sensing the immediate danger had passed, was now calmly munching on a tuft of dry grass. He approached her slowly, murmuring soothing words. Thomas, his small body trembling but his eyes wide with awe, slid off the mare and ran to Elias. "Papa, the wolves, they saved us." Elias knelt, pulling his son into a tight embrace. "They did, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It seems we have some rather fierce protectors out here." He looked back towards the rocky slopes where the wolves had vanished. It was a stark reminder of the wildness that permeated this land, a wildness that could be both a threat and, in its own inscrutable way, a guardian. Black Bear's words echoed in his mind. The land itself can be a threat, but there are also times when a man must know who his true neighbors are. Had the wolves been driven by instinct, or had something more ancient, more connected to the land guided their actions? Elias didn't have the answer, but he knew one thing for certain. He owed his cow, and perhaps more, to the wild heart of the West. Back at the ranch, as Elias secured Daisy in the slightly damaged corral, a profound sense of relief washed over him, mingled with a dawning realization of his precarious position. He had his cow back, a victory snatched from the jaws of a predatory scheme. But the encounter had left him shaken, acutely aware of the forces, both human and natural, that could conspire against him. Thomas, his initial fear giving way to exhilaration and wonder, chattered excitedly about the wolves, his small face flushed with the adventure. "They were so big, Papa, and they looked right at Silas. I think they knew he was bad." Elias listened, a faint smile touching his lips, but his mind was far from at ease. He knew that Silas and Jed would not forget this humiliation. They would return, perhaps with more men, fueled by a desire for revenge and the knowledge that Elias Thorn was a man who could be cornered. The wolves had provided a temporary reprieve, a wild intervention, but Elias couldn't rely on them to defend his ranch indefinitely. He spent the evening repairing the fence, his movements more thorough, more deliberate than before. He reinforced the weak points, adding extra bracing, his hands working with a quiet fury. He knew this was just a patch, a temporary solution. The real challenge lay in securing his future, in ensuring Thomas's safety and well-being in a land that offered so little security. As he worked, his thoughts drifted to Black Bear and the Crow encampment. The elders' counsel, once subtle, now felt like a direct warning. Elias had always maintained a respectful distance, a cautious observer of their ways. But the events of the day had forced him to confront a deeper truth. In this vast, untamed landscape, isolation was a luxury he could no longer afford. He thought about the carved wooden bird Black Bear had given him. It was a symbol, he now understood, of interconnectedness, of a shared reliance on the land. Elias, a rancher, understood the land in terms of pasture and water. The crow understood it in ways Elias could only dimly grasp, its rhythms, its secrets, its subtle languages. "Papa," Thomas said, interrupting his thoughts, "why did the wolves help us?" Elias paused his work, looking at his son. "I don't rightly know, son. Sometimes when people forget how to be good to the land, it has its own ways of reminding them." He sighed. "Or perhaps," he added, his gaze drifting towards the distant mountains, "it's a reminder that even in the wildest places, there are those who watch over what is theirs." He knew he needed to do more than just reinforce fences. He needed to strengthen his position, to build alliances that went beyond mere wary coexistence. The thought of approaching Black Bear again, of seeking a more direct understanding, a clearer path towards mutual support, began to take root. It was a daunting prospect, fraught with the potential for misunderstanding and cultural clashes, but the alternative, facing the escalating threats alone, was far more terrifying. As darkness descended, Elias lit a lantern, its warm glow casting flickering shadows across the cabin. He sat at the table, his hands resting on the worn wood, the carved bird lying beside them. He looked at Thomas, now asleep in his small bed, his breathing soft and even. The boy was the reason for it all, the reason he had to be strong, to be wise, to find a way to navigate the treacherous currents of the West. The gratitude he felt for the wolves was a complex emotion, intertwined with the fear of what tomorrow might bring. He had been given a reprieve, a glimpse of the land's fierce, untamed protection. But he also knew that the shadows of tomorrow held Silas and Jed, and the ever-present spectre of hardship. He had a cow back, but his larger struggle for survival, for security, for a future for his son, had only just begun, and he was beginning to understand that the path forward might lie not in standing alone, but in extending a hand, however hesitant, towards those who shared the vast, indifferent canvas of the West. The days following the confrontation in the ravine settled into a tense routine. Elias worked tirelessly, mending the fence, tending to Daisy, and keeping a constant vigil over the surrounding land. Every distant movement, every unusual sound sent a jolt of apprehension through him. He knew Silas and Jed were out there, nursing their wounded pride and plotting their next move. The encounter had been a stark lesson in the dangers of perceived weakness, and Elias was determined not to repeat his mistakes. Thomas, though still full of tales of the Wolf Guardians, also seemed to sense the underlying tension. He stayed closer to his father, his laughter less frequent, his eyes more watchful. Elias tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, teaching him his letters by the flickering lamplight, sharing simple meals, and recounting stories of Sarah, stories of resilience and quiet strength. One afternoon, as Elias was checking on his meager herd, a lone rider approached his ranch. His heart leaped into his throat, his hand instinctively going to his pistol. But as the rider drew closer, Elias recognized him. It was a young Crow warrior, the same one who had escorted him to Black Bear's teepee. The warrior dismounted, his demeanor respectful but his expression serious. "Elias Thorne," he said, his voice calm. "I bring a message from Black Bear." Elias felt a surge of relief, quickly followed by a knot of anxiety. What had brought the Crow to his isolated ranch? "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight. The warrior hesitated, glancing towards the north. "Black Bear has heard of your encounter. He sends word that Silas and Jed have been speaking ill of you in town. They speak of a lone rancher who mistreats his neighbors, who takes what is not his, and who relies on wild beasts for protection." Elias's jaw tightened. The insidious nature of Silas's lies stung him more than the threat of their physical return. They were not just trying to reclaim what they thought was theirs. They were trying to turn the community, the settlers, against him, painting him as a villain. "They are liars," Elias stated flatly. "They stole my cow. I was merely retrieving what was mine." The warrior nodded slowly. "Black Bear knows this. He has seen your actions over the years, but others, they listen to whispers. They see a man alone, and they believe what is easiest to believe." He paused, his gaze meeting Elias's. "Black Bear also sends word that some of the settlers are uneasy. They fear that the Crow are becoming too close to you. They say that white men should stick together and that you are consorting with savages." A cold dread washed over Elias. He was caught between two worlds, and the growing distrust was a dangerous current pulling him under. Silas's lies were poisoning the well, creating a wedge between him and the very people he needed to rely on for a sense of community and safety. And the Crow, in their quiet support, were becoming targets of that same suspicion. "What am I to do?" Elias asked, the question heavy with desperation. He looked at his small, isolated ranch, his son's future hanging precariously in the balance. The warrior's expression softened slightly. "Black Bear advises patience," Elias Thorne, "and vigilance. He says that true strength is not in isolation, but in knowing who your allies are and proving your worth through your actions. He also suggests a gesture." "A gesture?" Elias prompted. "There is a gathering in 3 days at the trading post. A time for traders and settlers to come together. Black Bear will be there. He wishes for you to attend, not to speak of Silas or of the wolves, but to simply be present, to show that you are a man who stands with his neighbors, no matter their color or their ways." The warrior turned to leave. "He also asks that you bring a gift, something that shows your respect for the land and for our ways." Elias watched the warrior ride away, the message settling over him like a heavy cloak. A gathering, a gesture. It was a precarious invitation, a step into a maelstrom of potential judgment. He was a man of few words, a rancher who preferred the company of his animals to the complexities of human interaction. To stand before a gathering of settlers, many of whom likely viewed him with suspicion for his independence, and to offer a gesture of goodwill towards the Crow. It felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. He looked at his ranch, at the repaired fences, at Daisy contentedly chewing her cud. He thought of Thomas, his innocent trust a beacon in the gathering darkness. Silas's lies were spreading like wildfire, threatening to consume him. But Black Bear's offer, though fraught with peril, was also a glimmer of hope. It was a chance to reaffirm his integrity, to counter the venomous whispers with a quiet, steadfast presence. He knew what he had to do. He had to accept Black Bear's invitation. He had to show them all that his gates, unlike the closed minds of some, would remain open. The scent of wood smoke, a comforting aroma for most, now carried a prickle of unease for Jonathan. Thomas, though physically recovering, seemed to carry a shadow in his eyes, a reflection of the stark contrast between the warmth he'd found amongst the Cheyenne and the lingering chill of his old life. The reunion, though joyous, had been a tumultuous affair. His mother, Eleanor, had wept uncontrollably, holding him as if he were a ghost, while Jonathan, his heart a tangled knot of relief and guilt, could only offer a gruff embrace, the words of thanks caught in his throat. Now, a week after Thomas's return, the whispers had begun. Not loud, overt accusations, but the insidious murmurings that festered in the isolated corners of their small settlement. "Too much time with the savages," muttered Old Man Hemlock, his rheumy eyes fixed on Jonathan as if he were harboring a contagion. "He'll be bringing their ways back with him." Sarah, a woman whose sharp tongue was as notorious as her baking skills, confided in a hushed tone to her neighbor, "Can't be natural, can it? A boy like that, from wolves and them. He's probably speaking their tongue now, thinking like them." Jonathan felt the weight of these judgments pressing down on him. He saw the wary glances, the subtle shifts in conversation when he approached. He had expected gratitude, perhaps even a measure of admiration for his son's survival, but instead he found suspicion. It was a different kind of wilderness, this social one, just as unforgiving as the one Thomas had just escaped. He tried to dismiss it, to shield Thomas from it, but he knew it was a battle he couldn't entirely win. Eleanor, usually the more sensitive to gossip, seemed to possess a newfound resilience. Her focus was entirely on Thomas, tending to his needs with a fierce maternal protectiveness. She'd noticed the changes in her son, the way he'd sometimes stare into the distance with an almost wistful expression, but she attributed it to the trauma. She'd hear the whispers too, of course, but her love for Thomas outweighed any societal pressure. Jonathan found himself increasingly drawn to the Cheyenne encampment. It wasn't just to express his gratitude, though that remained a driving force. It was a place where the air felt cleaner, the judgments less suffocating. He'd sit with Chief Blackwood, sharing a silence that was more profound than any conversation. Blackwood, his face a tapestry of weathered lines, would occasionally speak of the old ways, not with a sense of superiority, but with a quiet dignity that spoke of a deep connection to the land and to the cycle of life. "The boy's spirit is strong, Jonathan," Blackwood had said on Jonathan's last visit, his gaze steady. "He saw kindness where others see only difference. That is a strength that will serve him well." He then spoke of the wolves, not as monsters, but as creatures of instinct, creatures that understood the harsh laws of survival. "They are part of this land, as are we all." The boy understood this. He did not fight the wildness within him when it came. Jonathan found himself nodding, a strange sort of peace settling over him. He remembered the terror of that blizzard, the desperate howl of the wind, the primal fear that had gripped him. And then he remembered the image he'd conjured of Thomas, small and alone, facing those very wolves. The Cheyenne had not only saved his son from the wolves, they had saved him from a fate Jonathan couldn't bear to contemplate. As he rode back to his ranch, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jonathan knew the whispers wouldn't cease. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of defiance. He had seen something profound, something that transcended the ingrained prejudices of his world. His gates, he thought, looking towards the distant silhouette of the Cheyenne encampment, would indeed stay open. It was a promise he was beginning to understand. Thomas's reintegration into his old life was proving more challenging than Jonathan had anticipated. The boy who had returned was not quite the boy who had been lost. His laughter, once free and unrestrained, was now more measured, punctuated by moments of quiet contemplation. He would often be found staring out of the window, his gaze fixed on the distant rolling hills where the Cheyenne encampment lay. Eleanor, with her boundless love, tried to fill the void, showering him with affection, reintroducing him to his familiar toys, his books. But Thomas seemed distant, his attention often elsewhere. He'd flinch at sudden, loud noises, a habit he hadn't possessed before, and his sleep was sometimes troubled by restless dreams, though he never spoke of them. One afternoon, while helping Jonathan mend a fence, Thomas paused, his small hand tracing a pattern in the dirt. "The fire," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Jonathan looked up, confused. "What fire, son?" Thomas pointed towards a cluster of wildflowers. "The fire! It sang! The women sang! It kept the cold away." Jonathan realized he was talking about the Cheyenne campfires, the songs of the women that had soothed him. He felt a pang of something akin to jealousy, not of the Cheyenne themselves, but of the warmth, the community, the songs that had soothed his son when he had been alone and afraid. He knelt beside Thomas, his rough hands gentle. "It was a good fire, wasn't it? They were kind to you." Thomas nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. They shared their food. "The old woman, she told stories. Her hands were soft like yours, Papa." This small revelation, this simple comparison, was a bridge. Jonathan realized that the connection Thomas had forged wasn't just about survival. It was about genuine human connection, about being seen and cared for. He began to actively encourage Thomas to speak about his time with the Cheyenne, not as a traumatic event, but as an experience. He learned about the games they played, the respect they showed the land, the way they shared everything. He also learned about the fear. Thomas, in his innocent way, spoke of the wolves not just as a threat, but as a force of nature that the Cheyenne understood and respected. He described the chilling howls that echoed through the night, a sound that had initially terrified him, but which the Cheyenne had taught him to interpret as a sign of their presence, not necessarily their immediate danger. One evening, as Eleanor tucked Thomas into bed, he looked up at her. "Mama," he began, his voice soft. When the wolves came, I was scared. But then the warriors came. They made loud noises. The wolves ran away. The chief said they protected the fire. And they protected me because I was with the fire. Eleanor stroked his hair, her heart aching with a complex mixture of emotions. She saw the resilience in her son, the ability to find comfort and protection in the most unlikely of circumstances. "They were brave," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And you were brave too, my love." Jonathan, listening from the doorway, felt a profound sense of humility. He had been so consumed by his own fears and prejudices that he hadn't truly seen the depth of his son's experience. Thomas hadn't just been rescued, he had been integrated, cared for, and taught lessons that transcended mere survival. The language of the heart, Jonathan realized, was a language spoken not just in words, but in actions, in shared moments, in the quiet understanding that passed between souls. And Thomas, in his young, innocent way, had learned to speak it fluently. The fragile peace that had settled over the Miller Ranch began to fray at the edges. The whispers that had once been confined to hushed conversations among a few gossips started to gain traction, fueled by a growing unease and the inherent suspicion that often accompanied the unknown. Jonathan noticed it in the way some of his neighbors, men he'd worked alongside for years, now eyed him with a new kind of wariness. It began with small things. A reluctance to lend a hand when Jonathan needed it, a curt nod instead of a friendly greeting, an odd silence falling over a group when he approached. Then came the more direct inquiries. Jedediah Stone, a man whose opinion carried weight in the small community, stopped Jonathan by the general store. "Heard your boy's looking right fit, Jonathan," Jedediah began, his voice deceptively casual. "Good to hear, but some folks are saying he's changed. Seen him down by the creek, talking to himself, like he's arguing with ghosts." Jonathan felt a surge of anger, quickly suppressed. "He's a boy, Jedediah. He's been through a lot. He's just processing." Jedediah spat on the dusty ground. "Processing? Or is he learning things he shouldn't? Things from them?" His gaze flicked pointedly towards the distant hills. "It ain't natural, Jonathan. A white boy, raised by the Cheyenne. Who knows what seeds they've planted in his head?" The implication hung heavy in the air. It wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about Jonathan's own judgment, his willingness to accept the help that had saved his son. The unspoken accusation was that by associating with the Cheyenne, even in gratitude, Jonathan was somehow betraying his own kind. Eleanor too felt the shift. The women who had once shared recipes and neighborhood news now offered tight-lipped smiles. A few mothers, whose children had previously played with Thomas, now kept them close, their eyes filled with a manufactured concern. "We don't want them getting any wild ideas," one mother explained to Eleanor, her voice laced with a thinly veiled disdain. This created a growing tension within the Miller household. Thomas, sensitive to the atmosphere, became more withdrawn. He'd stopped talking about his time with the Cheyenne, sensing the disapproval that his innocent stories now evoked. He'd retreat to his room, his drawings becoming his sole outlet. These drawings, once filled with farm animals and simple landscapes, now depicted stark, primal scenes. Wolves with glowing eyes, figures huddled around a fire, a lone boy standing between two worlds. Jonathan found himself wrestling with a growing frustration. He had always prided himself on his independence, his self-reliance. But now he felt isolated, judged by the very community he belonged to. He saw the fear in their eyes, a fear rooted in generations of conflict and misunderstanding. It was a fear that had kept people apart, that had fueled countless skirmishes and broken promises. One evening, as he sat by the fireplace, watching Thomas meticulously draw a wolf's head, Jonathan felt a profound weariness. The battle to save his son from the elements had been fierce, but the battle to protect him from the prejudice of his own kind felt like an endless, uphill struggle. He glanced at Eleanor, Her brow furrowed as she tried to coax Thomas into eating his supper. He knew he couldn't let these seeds of doubt take root. He had to find a way to counter the rising tide of fear, not just for his son's sake, but for the sake of a future where understanding could prevail. The mounting pressure from the community weighed heavily on Jonathan. The subtle ostracization was becoming more pronounced, and he could see the effect it was having on Thomas, who retreated further into himself. He knew he couldn't navigate this alone, and his thoughts, increasingly, turned to Chief Blackwood. It was an unconventional step, seeking counsel from a man of a different tribe, a man many in his own community still viewed with suspicion. But Jonathan had seen the wisdom in Blackwood's eyes, the deep understanding that transcended superficial differences. He rode to the Cheyenne encampment, the familiar path now feeling charged with a sense of desperation. As he approached, he was met not with the wary silence he might have expected from some of his own kind, but with a quiet acknowledgement. A few Cheyenne men nodded as he passed, their faces impassive but not hostile. He found Chief Blackwood sitting by his tepee, mending a bow, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Jonathan dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. "Chief Blackwood," he began, his voice rough with emotion. I need your counsel." Blackwood looked up, his dark eyes calm and observant. He gestured to a spot beside him. "Sit, Jonathan. The wind carries your troubles, even before you speak them." Jonathan explained the situation, the whispers, the growing suspicion, the way his son was being affected. He spoke of the fear that seemed to grip his community, a fear that painted the Cheyenne as a threat, even after their act of kindness. Blackwood listened patiently, his gaze never leaving Jonathan's face. When Jonathan finished, a long silence settled between them, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. "Fear," Blackwood finally said, his voice a low rumble, "is a wildfire. It consumes reason, it blinds the eyes. Your people, they have known much fear of us, and perhaps we have known fear of them. It is an old wound, Jonathan, that festers in the darkness." He paused, then continued, "But your son, he saw no fear in the eyes of the wolf, only the hunger. He saw no fear in our eyes, only the helping hand. He carries a different understanding, a seed of something new." "But how do I make them see?" Jonathan pleaded. "How do I make them understand that what they did, it saved my boy, that it was not an act of malice, but of compassion?" Blackwood turned his full attention to Jonathan, his gaze penetrating. "You cannot force understanding, Jonathan. You can only offer the truth and tend to the seeds of doubt that fear plants. You have shown your gratitude. Your son carries the memory of kindness. This is a strong foundation." He picked up a smooth grey stone from the ground. "This stone," he said, turning it over in his hand, "is hard. It has been shaped by wind and water, by time, yet it yields to the river. It does not fight the current, but flows with it, allowing the water to shape it. Your people are like this stone. Their fear is the hardness. You cannot break it with force. You must find the gentle current, the slow shaping." Blackwood then offered a practical suggestion. "The harvest festival is coming. Your community will gather. You will be there. Your son will be there. Let him be seen. Let him be healthy and whole. Let your actions speak louder than their whispers. Do not hide him, Jonathan. Do not let their fear isolate him. Let him be a reminder of what was and what can be." He looked out towards the setting sun, a hint of melancholy in his expression. "The past is a powerful river, but the future is a land yet to be explored. You have walked a path with us, Jonathan. Do not turn back now. Your gates are open. Keep them open." Jonathan felt a sense of clarity wash over him. Blackwood's counsel wasn't about winning arguments or changing minds overnight. It was about patience, about demonstrating the truth through consistent action, and about allowing time and shared experience to erode the walls of prejudice. He thanked the chief, a genuine warmth spreading through him. As he rode back towards his ranch, The weight on his shoulders felt lighter, replaced by a quiet determination. He had a plan, and it started with showing his son and his community the enduring power of an open heart. The air in the small settlement was thick with anticipation, a blend of the usual autumn bounty and a palpable undercurrent of unease. The annual harvest festival, typically a time of joyous celebration, felt more like a stage for unspoken judgments this year. Jonathan, with Eleanor by his side, brought Thomas to the gathering. The boy, dressed in his best clothes, held his father's hand tightly, his eyes wide as he surveyed the familiar faces, some of which now held a new, uncertain expression. Jonathan had taken Chief Blackwood's advice to heart. He made a point of greeting everyone, not with defensiveness, but with a calm, open demeanor. He introduced Eleanor to new arrivals, his voice steady and clear, and he let Thomas be. He didn't force him to speak, didn't push him to engage. He simply allowed his son to exist, a living testament to his survival and the unexpected kindness that had been shown to him. Thomas, perhaps sensing his father's quiet strength, seemed to relax. He watched the other children play with a mixture of curiosity and hesitant longing. A few of the younger ones, less burdened by adult prejudices, approached him. They pointed at the intricate carving of a bird on his wooden toy, a gift from the Cheyenne. "Where'd you get that?" a freckled boy named Billy asked, his eyes wide with interest. Thomas hesitated for a moment, then a small smile flickered across his lips. "A friend," he replied softly, "made it for me." The word friend hung in the air, a small, unexpected ripple in the sea of suspicion. Billy, unconcerned with the deeper implications, nodded. "It's real nice." He then nudged his companion. "Want to see my new slingshot?" The interaction, seemingly insignificant, was a crack in the wall. Jonathan saw it, and so did Eleanor. They exchanged a knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement of progress. Later, as Jonathan was helping to unload a wagon of supplies, Jedediah Stone approached him, his usual gruffness softened, though not entirely absent. "Miller," he grunted, picking up a sack of flour. "Boy looks well, strong even." Jonathan met his gaze, a hint of the peace he'd found with Blackwood in his eyes. "He is, Jedediah. He's a strong boy." Jedediah gave a curt nod, then added almost as an afterthought, Heard some of the Cheyenne might be coming to trade later in the week. Some of the fellas are talking about keeping an eye out." Jonathan's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, but then he remembered Blackwood's words about gentle currents. "They'll be welcome," Jonathan said, his voice firm and clear. "They traded with us before, and I've no reason to believe they've changed. They're good folk, Jedediah. They know how to respect boundaries, and they know how to show kindness." He looked directly at Jedediah, his gaze unwavering. "My gates stay open," he stated, the words carrying a new weight, a personal conviction. "They stayed open for my son when he was lost, and they'll stay open for those who showed him mercy." Jedediah held his gaze for a moment, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He didn't respond directly, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. He simply nodded and turned back to the wagon. As the day wore on, Jonathan observed more such moments, hesitant conversations that ended with a tentative handshake, wary glances that were replaced by neutral expressions. It wasn't a wholesale change, not an overnight conversion, but it was a beginning. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had been met with an unwavering display of gratitude and a quiet assertion of principled tolerance. The seeds of doubt that had been sown were now being challenged by the tangible presence of a healthy, happy child and a father who refused to succumb to prejudice. The days following the harvest festival felt different. The air in the settlement, while not entirely free of its old suspicions, carried a lighter current. Jonathan noticed the change in his neighbors' interactions. The tight-lipped smiles had become more genuine. The curt nods were replaced by more robust greetings. The whispers hadn't ceased entirely, but their volume had diminished, overshadowed by the undeniable evidence of Thomas's well-being and Jonathan's steadfast resolve. One crisp autumn morning, a small group of Cheyenne, led by Chief Blackwood, arrived at the settlement. They carried pelts, intricately woven baskets, and tools for trade. A ripple of apprehension went through some of the settlers, but it was quickly tempered by Jonathan's actions. He was the first to approach, his smile warm and unforced. "Chief Blackwood," he greeted, extending his hand. "Welcome. We've been expecting you." He then turned to his neighbors, who had gathered at a respectful distance. "These are friends," he announced, his voice carrying clearly. "They came when my son was lost. They brought him back to me. They shared their warmth and their wisdom. We owe them our respect and our gratitude." He gestured towards his ranch, a comfortable distance from the main settlement but clearly visible. "My gates stay open," he reiterated, looking directly at Jedediah Stone, who stood nearby, his expression thoughtful. "Always, for those who have shown such kindness and for those willing to understand." The Cheyenne traders engaged in their transactions with a quiet dignity. They were not seeking to impose themselves, but to participate in the reciprocal flow of goods and goodwill. Jonathan facilitated the exchanges, his presence a silent reassurance. He observed his son, Thomas, playing with some of the younger Cheyenne children, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. It was a scene that just weeks prior would have been unthinkable to many in his community. Jedediah Stone, after completing his trade, approached Jonathan again. This time, there was no preamble, no attempt at casualness. He simply looked at Jonathan, then at the Cheyenne, and finally at Thomas, who was now showing a Cheyenne girl his wooden bird. "You might be right, Miller," Jedediah said, his voice gruff but sincere. "You might just be right about those gates. Hard to argue with a boy who's alive and smiling." He extended his hand, and Jonathan clasped it firmly. Over the following weeks, the relationship between the settlers and the Cheyenne began to shift. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but a gradual thawing, a slow acceptance born from shared necessity and a growing understanding. Jonathan's open gates became a symbol, not just for his ranch, but for a potential bridge between two worlds. Eleanor, watching Thomas sleep soundly one night, no longer saw the shadow of fear, but the quiet strength of a boy who had experienced both profound danger and profound kindness. He had been touched by the wildness of the wolves, the wisdom of the Cheyenne, and the love of his family. He was a living embodiment of the possibility of connection, a testament to the fact that empathy could flourish even in the harshest of landscapes. Jonathan, standing on his porch, gazing out at the vast, star-dusted expanse, felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been fraught with peril, both external and internal. He had faced the raw fury of nature and the deeply ingrained prejudices of man. But in the end, he had chosen compassion over fear, understanding over animosity. He knew there would be future challenges, future tests of this fragile peace. But as he looked at the distant soft glow of the Cheyenne encampment, he knew he had made the right choice. His gates and his heart would remain open.